When Judas had led the armed guard to Gethsemane and shown them which was the man to be arrested, his part in the plot was over. He was free to go away and begin a new life. But now that the plan had been successfully carried out, the full horror of what he'd done began to dawn on him. Judas had lived close to Jesus for 3 years, and he knew that Jesus had never done a wrong or unkind thing. But he knew that those cruel, ruthless men would not rest until they had brought about his death. On a sudden impulse, Judas set off, half running, to the temple to find the men he had bargained with. "I have done wrong," he said to them. "I have helped you to arrest a man who is completely innocent." "That's your affair," they told him. "We really don't care how you feel about it." And they went on with the conversation that he'd interrupted. With a cry of despair, Judas hurled down the 30 silver coins they'd paid him and fled. Then he took a rope and hanged himself. All night long, Jesus stood before the council, listening to the false charges they made. None of the witnesses they called told the same story. They could prove nothing against Jesus. At last, in desperation, the high priest challenged Jesus directly. "Tell me on oath," he demanded, "are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" "I am," Jesus replied. "That settles the matter," the high priest declared. "The prisoner has claimed to be divine. He deserves, by our law, to die." But only Pilate, the Roman governor, could pass the death sentence. They must convince him that Jesus had committed crimes worthy of death by Roman reckoning. They handed Jesus over to the guards, who tormented and ill-treated him, while they made their plans. Early in the morning they took Jesus, in chains, to Pilate's palace. Pilate was in Jerusalem to keep order during the excitable days of the Passover. "This man has been stirring up trouble," they told Pilate. "He tells people not to pay taxes, and he says he's a king." If these charges were true, Jesus would be sentenced to death. But Pilate was certain that the Jewish leaders had trumped up the charges because they were jealous of him. He began to cross-question Jesus himself, and could find nothing wrong that he had done. All the while, the mob below in the street, mustered and led by the priests and leaders, were chanting over and over, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate came out to speak to them. "This man is completely innocent," he announced. "He doesn't deserve to die." The chant swelled to a deafening roar. "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate tried another way out. "It's Passover time," he said. "I shall set a prisoner free as part of the celebrations. Let me set Jesus free." But the leaders were ready with a new slogan. "We want Barabbas! We want Barabbas!" As the crowd took up the cry, Barabbas was a mob leader in prison for murder. Pilate was at his wit's end. If the crowd rioted, he might lose his job. He dare not release Jesus, even though Roman justice declared him innocent. He decided to wash his hands of the whole matter and hand Jesus over, to be put to death by crucifixion, as the mob insisted. Pilate gave in to the wishes of the mob and their Jewish leaders. He set Barabbas free and ordered his mercenaries to whip Jesus before taking him to be crucified. After they had whipped Jesus, the Roman soldiers teased him cruelly. One of them quickly put together an imitation crown from sharp-speared thorn twigs and rammed it down on his head. Then they knelt to him in mock homage, proclaiming, "Long live the King!" before spitting in his face. Soon it was time to take the prisoner to the place of execution. By Jewish law, this had to be outside the city gates. The little procession set off down the hill towards Golgotha, which means Skull Place. A mocking, shouting crowd followed, and a few women went too, crying to see the good, brave teacher being led off to die. Prisoners were expected to carry the rough wooden crossbar on which they would be executed, and the soldiers had already laid the heavy beam on Jesus' shoulders. but Jesus was weak from the long interrogations and the whipping. He could scarcely walk upright beneath its weight. An African Jew, called Simon, up for the Passover, came striding up the hill towards them. "Here, you," the centurion called, laying a firm hand on his arm. "Carry the cross for the prisoner. We'll never get there at the rate we're going." Simon was strong and broad-shouldered. He carefully lifted the cross from Jesus' shoulders and hoisted it onto his own. Together they walked the rest of the rough road to Golgotha. The Romans crucified troublesome slaves and desperate criminals. Roman citizens were spared such a cruel death. Large nails were driven through the victim's feet and outstretched hands, in order to fix him to the crossbeams of wood. The cross was set in a socket in the ground, and then lifted up, so that the criminal was suspended, left to die from heat and thirst. There were 3 prisoners to be crucified that day, and the execution squad set to work. By 9 o'clock, the 3 crosses were lifted into position. Jesus was on the centre one. Then the soldiers settled down to wait, gambling with dice to while away the time. Jesus looked down at them with pity. "Forgive them, Father," he prayed. "They don't know what they're doing." The Jewish leaders had arrived to gloat and jeer. "You saved others," they said mockingly, "but you can't save yourself." One of the criminals hanging on the next cross muttered hoarsely, "Aren't you supposed to be the Messiah? Why don't you save us all?" But the other criminal said, "You be quiet. We deserve to die, but this man is innocent." Then he begged Jesus, "When you become king, please remember me." "You don't have to wait until then," Jesus replied. "You will be with me in paradise this very day." Some of Jesus' disciples, mostly the women, were there too. "Look after my mother," Jesus said to his close friend John. John nodded. "He'll be a son to you now," Jesus told his mother, who stood crying bitterly. At noon, when the sun should have been the brightest, thick darkness fell. For 3 hours Jesus suffered all alone, carrying the weight of the whole world's sin. Then, at 3 o'clock, he called out in a clear, triumphant voice, "It is finished." Then he gave up his life and died. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy citizen, asked Pilate's permission to give Jesus a proper burial. Nicodemus, who had visited Jesus at night, came to help him. The 2 men gently washed the body, wrapped it in clean linen, and laid it on a stone ledge in the cave tomb in Joseph's garden. Some of the women who had been at Golgotha followed to see where Jesus was buried. Then, worn out with sadness and crying, they went away.